Welcome, weary traveller, to another quiet evening with the Sleep Detective. As the world outside your window settles into darkness, we're going to journey together through one of history's most enduring mysteries. Not to startle or frighten, but to explore gently, like archaeologists of the mind, brushing dust from old questions that have whispered through more than a century of London fog. Tonight we walk the cobblestone streets of Whitechapel in 1888, when gas lamps cast dancing shadows on brick walls and horse-drawn carriages clattered through narrow alleys where history was being written in ways no one could have imagined. We're not here to solve what greater minds than ours have pondered for generations, but rather to understand why some mysteries capture our imaginations so completely, and how the search for answers can be as meaningful as the answers themselves. The question that draws us into the gaslit past is simple yet profound. Was Jack the Ripper ever caught? But like all truly compelling mysteries, the simple question opens doorways to a dozen others. Who was he? Why did he stop? And perhaps most intriguingly, why do we still care so deeply about events that unfolded when our great-great-grandparents were young? As we settle into this investigation together, imagine yourself wrapped in the comfort of a warm library surrounded by leather-bound volumes and flickering candlelight. The chaos and fear of those autumn months in 1888 are long past. We're safe here, observers from a distant future, able to examine the evidence with calm curiosity, rather than the terror that once gripped London's East End. The story we're about to explore isn't just about a killer who vanished into history. It's about the dedicated investigators who spent their lives searching for truth, the ordinary people whose lives intersected with extraordinary events, and the slow, methodical work of building understanding from fragments of evidence scattered across decades. So let your breathing slow, let your shoulders relax, and prepare to lose yourself in a tale that begins not with violence, but with a city learning to see itself differently, and investigators learning that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't the answers we find, but the questions we learn to ask along the way. Chapter 1. The Whitechapel Shadows. The autumn of 1888 arrived in London like a curtain being drawn slowly across the city, bringing with it the familiar sense of coal smoke and damp wool, the early darkness that wrapped around buildings like an old coat. In the East End, where narrow streets twisted between tenements and workshops, life continued its ancient rhythm of survival and small joys, unaware that these particular months would echo through history long after the season had passed. Whitechapel in those days was a place where different worlds collided and overlapped. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe lived alongside Irish families who had fled famine decades earlier. Street vendors called out their wares in a dozen languages, while children played games that had been passed down through generations of London's working poor. The smell of bread from the bakeries, mixed with the less pleasant odours of industry and overcrowded living, creating a tapestry of human experience that was both harsh and oddly comforting in its familiarity. The gas lamps that lined the main thoroughfares created pools of yellow light, but between them lay stretches of shadow where anything might hide. These weren't the broad well-lit streets of Westminster or Mayfair. Here the darkness seemed to have texture, weight, personality. It gathered in doorways and collected in the spaces between buildings, and those who lived in Whitechapel had learned to navigate by sound as much as sight, recognizing the footsteps of neighbours, the particular creak of their own building's stairs, the distant whistle of the night watchman making his rounds. In the pubs and coffee houses, conversation flowed in comfortable patterns established over years of shared hardship and small triumphs. Men discussed the work they hoped to find tomorrow. Women shared news of family members who had written from America or Australia, and everyone speculated about the political changes sweeping through the country. The Irish Home Rule question dominated the newspapers, and there was talk of new reforms that might improve conditions for working families. Life was hard, but it was their life, and they had found ways to create warmth and meaning within its constraints. The police presence in the area was light but familiar. Constables walked their beats with the measured pace of men who knew their territory, greeting shopkeepers by name and keeping an eye on the usual troublemakers. Crime existed, of course, but it followed predictable patterns. Pickpockets worked the markets, disputes over money or affection sometimes turned violent, and the occasional burglar might try his luck with a poorly secured shop. These were problems the community and the police had learned to manage together, part of the urban ecosystem that had evolved over decades of coexistence. Women moved through these streets with the particular awareness that their gender required, but not with the kind of fear that would soon transform the entire neighborhood. They walked in groups when possible, avoided the darkest alleys, and looked out for one another with the solidarity that emerges naturally among people who face similar challenges. The prostitutes who worked the area were known to the local constables, not as criminals to be pursued, but as part of the community's complex social fabric, women trying to survive in a world that offered them few alternatives. As September deepened into October, there was a sense of change in the air that had nothing to do with the coming winter. People began to notice things they might have overlooked before: strangers lingering in doorways, unfamiliar sounds in the night, a quality to the silence that felt different somehow. These were subtle shifts, the kind of atmospheric changes that communities sense before anyone can articulate exactly what has changed. Inspector Frederick Abberline had walked these streets for 14 years before the autumn of 1888 brought him face to face with a mystery that would define the rest of his career. At 45, he was a man shaped by decades of police work, with the kind of steady presence that made witnesses feel safe enough to tell him what they had seen, and the patient intelligence that could piece together stories from fragments of evidence and half-remembered details. On the morning he first encountered what would become known as the Ripper case, Abberline approached the crime scene with the methodical calm that had served him well throughout his career. He had investigated murders before, had seen violence in its various forms. But there was something about this particular scene that made him pause and take a deeper breath before beginning his examination. Not from shock or revulsion, but from the immediate recognition that he was looking at something that would require every skill he had developed over his years in the Metropolitan Police. The body lay in Bucks Row, now called Durward Street, in a posture that suggested both violence and an odd kind of careful arrangement. Abberline knelt beside the victim, noting details with the precision that had made him one of the East End's most trusted investigators. The positioning of the hands, the nature of the wounds, the fact that despite the violence inflicted, there were no signs of a struggle in the surrounding area. These observations would prove significant later, but at that moment, they were simply pieces of information to be carefully recorded and preserved. Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn, the local physician who had been called to examine the body, worked alongside Abberline with the kind of professional cooperation that develops between men who have dealt with London's darker side for many years. Their conversation was quiet, technical, focused on the physical evidence before them, rather than speculation about what it might mean. The doctor's initial assessment was thorough but preliminary, the beginning of what would become an extensive forensic investigation using the best scientific methods available in the late 19th century. The gathering crowd of onlookers was managed with the gentle firmness that characterized good community policing. In those days, Abberline understood that these people weren't merely curious bystanders, but neighbors and friends of the victim members of a community that was beginning to realize something unprecedented was happening in their midst. He answered their questions when he could reassure them about increased police presence and made mental notes about who was asking what kinds of questions. Word of the murder spread through Whitechapel with the particular speed that news travels in close-knit communities. By afternoon, conversations in shops and pubs had taken on a different quality. People who had lived their entire lives in the area began to discuss safety precautions they had never needed to consider before. Women made plans to walk together, after dark men offered to escort female neighbors to and from work, and everyone found themselves paying attention to sounds and shadows they had previously ignored. Abberline spent the rest of that day conducting interviews with a thoroughness that would characterize his entire approach to the case. He spoke with residents of the nearby buildings, workers who had been in the area early that morning, and anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual in the hours before the discovery of the body. These conversations revealed the rich complexity of life in Whitechapel, the networks of relationship and routine that created the social fabric of the neighborhood. What struck Abberline most during these initial interviews was not what people had seen, but what they hadn't. In an area where neighbors knew each other's schedules, where the sound of footsteps on cobblestones could identify individuals even in darkness, where the community's informal surveillance system usually meant that little went unnoticed, someone had committed an act of extreme violence without leaving any witnesses or creating any disturbance that anyone could remember. 3 weeks later, when Annie Chapman's body was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, the whispers that had been circulating through Whitechapel since the Bucks Row murder suddenly crystallized into something approaching certainty. Inspector Abberline stood in the early morning light, looking down at a scene that bore unmistakable similarities to what he had encountered before, and felt the particular chill that comes with recognizing that random violence has given way to something methodical and deliberate. The similarities were too specific to be coincidental, too precise to be the work of different individuals. The positioning of the body, the nature of the wounds, the surgical precision that suggested knowledge of human anatomy, the absence of any sign that the victim had cried out or struggled. Most significantly, there was the same quality of careful arrangement, as if the killer had taken time after the violence to compose the scene, according to some internal logic that remained hidden from the investigators. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, who examined Annie Chapman's body, brought decades of medical experience to his assessment of the physical evidence. His preliminary findings, shared quietly with Abberline, suggested that they were dealing with someone who possessed at least basic anatomical knowledge and who had used sharp surgical instruments with considerable skill. This wasn't the work of a common criminal or someone acting in a frenzy of uncontrolled violence, but rather someone who approached his terrible work with the kind of methodical precision more commonly associated with medical procedures. The news of the second murder spread through London with a speed that surprised even seasoned newspaper reporters. What had been a local tragedy in the East End suddenly became a matter of citywide concern and then national interest. The combination of the unusual nature of the crimes, their location in an area already associated in the public mind with poverty and danger, and the apparent skill of the perpetrator, created a story that captured imaginations far beyond Whitechapel's boundaries. Abberline found himself coordinating with investigators from other divisions, sharing information with medical experts from across London, and briefing senior officials who had never before taken particular interest in East End criminal matters. The resources being devoted to the case were unprecedented for crimes involving victims from Whitechapel's working poor, a fact that wasn't lost on the local community, where people began to wonder whether the attention was motivated by genuine concern for their safety or by fear that the violence might spread to more affluent areas of the city. The pattern that was emerging wasn't just in the physical evidence, but in the timing and location of the crimes. Both murders had occurred in the early morning hours, in areas that were usually busy during the day, but relatively quiet at night. Both victims had been found in positions that suggested they had been approached by someone they didn't fear, someone who had managed to get close enough to strike without creating any disturbance that might alert nearby residents. Letters began arriving at newspaper offices and police stations, some clearly from cranks and attention seekers, others containing details that made investigators pause and consider more carefully. The handwriting analysis techniques available in 1888 were primitive by modern standards, but experienced clerks and postal workers could still make educated assessments about the origins and authenticity of correspondence. Most of the letters were quickly dismissed as hoaxes, but a few contained information that hadn't been released to the public, suggesting that their authors might have genuine knowledge of the crimes. The community response to the emerging pattern was complex and multifaceted. Fear, certainly, but also a kind of grim determination that reflected the resilience that had allowed East End residents to survive decades of economic hardship and social neglect. Neighbourhood watch groups formed spontaneously, not through official organisation, but through the natural networks of mutual support that already existed in the area. Women changed their routines. Men volunteered to escort neighbours, and everyone began to pay attention to strangers in ways that would have seemed unfriendly just months earlier. As October progressed, Abberline and his colleagues found themselves investigating not just two murders, but the emergence of something entirely new in London's criminal landscape. The careful, methodical nature of the crimes combined with the killer's apparent ability to move through the East End without detection suggested that they were dealing with someone who understood the area intimately, someone who could blend into the community while harbouring intentions that were becoming increasingly clear with each discovery. Chapter 2. Letters in the Dark. On September 27, 1888, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency that would transform the Whitechapel murders from a local police matter into a phenomenon that gripped the imagination of people across Britain and beyond. The envelope was addressed in red ink, the handwriting bold and confident, and the contents would introduce a name to history that would become synonymous with mystery and terror: Jack the Ripper. Tom Bullen, the agency's chief clerk, had seen thousands of letters cross his desk during his years handling correspondence for one of London's most prominent news organisations: anonymous tips, political rants, personal vendettas disguised as news stories, claims of vast conspiracies and hidden scandals. Most could be dismissed after a quick glance filed away or discarded as the products of minds seeking attention or revenge. But this particular letter demanded more careful consideration, not just because of its subject matter, but because of the voice that emerged from its crude yet oddly articulate prose. Dear Boss, it began with a familiarity that was both casual and somehow menacing. The writer claimed responsibility for the Whitechapel murders, describing details that hadn't been released to the public, and demonstrating a knowledge of the crimes that went beyond what could be gleaned from newspaper reports. More unsettling still was the tone which combined braggadocio with a kind of gleeful anticipation of future violence, as if the writer was treating the entire situation as an elaborate game being played for the entertainment of London's newspaper reading public. The letter's author seemed to understand exactly how to craft a message that would be impossible for journalists to ignore. He provided just enough specific detail to suggest genuine involvement, while maintaining an air of theatrical mystery that practically begged for publication. The promise of future communications. The mock-apologetic tone regarding the quality of his handwriting. The casual mention of the next job he was planning all combined to create a document that was simultaneously horrifying and oddly compelling. Bullen brought the letter to the attention of his editor, John Moore, who read it with the careful attention that senior journalists bring to potentially significant developments in ongoing stories. The Whitechapel murders had already generated considerable reader interest, but this letter had the potential to transform the story into something unprecedented in the history of London journalism. At the same time, both men were acutely aware of their responsibility not to publish material that might inflame public panic or interfere with police investigations. The decision to share the letter with the Metropolitan Police was made quickly, though not without considerable discussion about whether the agency should also consider publishing it immediately. The potential circulation benefits were obvious, but so were the ethical implications of giving a platform to someone claiming to be a murderer. Ultimately, professional judgment won out over commercial considerations, and a copy of the letter was delivered to Scotland Yard. While the original was secured for further analysis, Inspector Abberline examined the letter with the same methodical attention he brought to physical evidence at crime scenes. The handwriting was distinctive, confident, but not necessarily educated. The language revealed someone familiar with London dialect and colloquialisms, but also capable of constructing coherent sentences and organising thoughts in a logical sequence. Most intriguingly, certain phrases suggested someone who understood how newspapers operated, who knew exactly what kind of language would capture editorial attention and generate public interest. The police analysis of the letter focused on several key elements. The red ink, which was unusual but not unique. The paper, which appeared to be common commercial stationery, available throughout London, and the postmark, which indicated the letter had been mailed from the East End handwriting experts, were consulted. Though the scientific analysis of written documents was still in its infancy in 1888, and their conclusions were necessarily tentative and speculative. What troubled investigators most wasn't the letter's content, disturbing as that was, but its implications for the nature of the crimes they were investigating. A killer who took time to write letters to newspapers, who seemed to crave public attention and media coverage, represented a fundamentally different challenge from someone committing crimes of passion or economic desperation. This suggested a level of premeditation and psychological complexity that would require new approaches to criminal investigation. Dr. Thomas Bond, the consulting surgeon who had been brought in to provide medical expertise to the investigation, found himself examining not just physical evidence from crime scenes, but the psychological evidence contained in the correspondence that continued to arrive at newspaper offices and police stations. His medical training had given him experience in observing human behavior and psychological state skills that proved unexpectedly relevant to analyzing the letters that claimed to be from the Whitechapel killer. The Dear Boss letter revealed several characteristics that interested medical professionals of the era. The handwriting showed no signs of the tremor or instability that might be expected from someone suffering from obvious mental illness or physical debility. Instead, it demonstrated a steady hand and consistent letter formation that suggested someone in reasonable physical health and possessed of basic literacy skills. The spelling errors that appeared throughout the text seemed more likely to reflect limited education rather than any cognitive impairment. More intriguing to Victorian medical thinking was the tone of the correspondence, which combined elements that seemed almost contradictory. The writer displayed what appeared to be genuine pride in his work, describing the murders with the kind of satisfaction a craftsman might express regarding a particularly challenging project. At the same time, there was an awareness of public reaction that suggested someone who remained connected to normal social emotions, even while claiming to commit acts that violated fundamental social taboos. Dr. L. Forbes Winslow, a prominent alienist who had made a specialty of studying criminal psychology, was consulted regarding the mental state that might produce such correspondence. His analysis, conducted using the theoretical frameworks available in the late 19th century, suggested that the letter writer might represent a new category of criminal personality, someone who combined rational planning abilities with a complete absence of normal moral constraints. This was a disturbing concept that challenged contemporary understanding of criminal behavior. The medical experts were particularly struck by the writer's apparent understanding of public psychology and media dynamics. The letter seemed designed to maximize impact not just on law enforcement officials, but on the general public who would eventually read about it in newspaper accounts. This suggested someone who thought strategically about the broader implications of his actions, who understood that the murders themselves were only part of a larger communication he was attempting to establish with London society. Handwriting analysis in 1888 relied heavily on the observational skills of experienced clerks and document examiners, rather than the scientific techniques that would be developed in later decades. Nevertheless, several experts who examined the original letter noted characteristics that would prove consistent across multiple pieces of correspondence attributed to the same source. The formation of certain letters, the pressure applied to the pen, the spacing between words all suggested a single author who maintained consistent writing habits even when discussing disturbing subject matter. The language patterns revealed in the letters provided additional clues about the writer's background and psychology. The vocabulary was extensive enough to suggest reasonable education, but the grammatical constructions and spelling choices indicated someone from London's working classes, rather than professional or upper-class backgrounds. Certain phrases suggested familiarity with East End dialect, while others seemed deliberately crafted to create a specific impression on readers from different social backgrounds. What emerged from the medical analysis was a portrait of someone who defied easy categorization according to existing theories of criminal behavior. The letter writer appeared to be neither a victim of obvious mental illness nor a simple criminal motivated by greed or passion. Instead, he seemed to represent something new in the landscape of urban crime, someone who committed violence as a form of communication, who treated murder as a means of establishing a relationship with the broader public through the medium of newspaper coverage. By mid-October 1888, the success of the Dear Boss letter in capturing public attention had inspired a flood of similar correspondence that threatened to overwhelm both newspaper offices and police investigators. Letters arrived daily, sometimes hourly, each claiming to be from the Whitechapel killer, each offering theories, confessions, or threats that required careful evaluation to determine which, if any, might be genuine communications from the actual perpetrator. The Central News Agency found itself at the centre of a phenomenon that had no precedent in London journalism. The combination of genuine public fear, morbid curiosity, and the particular fascination that the anonymous letter format seemed to generate had created a situation where distinguishing authentic communications from elaborate hoaxes became a specialised skill requiring considerable time and attention from experienced staff members. Some letters were obviously fraudulent, written in hands that bore no resemblance to the original correspondence, or containing information that contradicted known facts about the crimes. Others demonstrated careful attention to newspaper reports and might have been written by individuals with genuine knowledge of the East End, even if they weren't actually involved in the murders. A few, however, contained details that hadn't been released to the public, information that suggested their authors might have legitimate connections to the ongoing investigations. Inspector Abberline established a systematic process for evaluating the correspondence, working with handwriting experts and medical professionals to develop criteria that might help identify genuinely significant letters. The original Dear Boss letter served as a baseline for comparison, though investigators remained aware that a clever hoaxer might be able to mimic its characteristics well enough to fool cursory examination. The geographic origins of the letters provided interesting insights into how the Whitechapel murders had captured imaginations across Britain and beyond. Postmarks revealed correspondence arriving from Scotland, Ireland, and various English counties, suggesting that the story had achieved national significance in ways that local London crimes rarely did. The International Mail brought letters from as far away as America and Australia, indicating that the mystery had somehow transcended its origins in East End poverty to become a subject of worldwide fascination. Some of the letters contained genuine attempts to provide helpful information to the police, written by citizens who believed they had observed suspicious behaviour or possessed knowledge that might be relevant to the investigation. These well-intentioned communications required careful follow-up even, though they rarely provided actionable intelligence. The writers ranged from concerned neighbours reporting unusual activities to medical professionals offering theoretical insights into the psychological profile of the killer. More disturbing were the letters that seemed motivated by a desire to participate vicariously in the violence written by individuals who appeared to derive some form of satisfaction from imagining themselves in the killer's position. These communications revealed aspects of public psychology that troubled both investigators and journalists, suggesting that the murders had unleashed something in the collective imagination that went beyond simple curiosity about criminal behaviour. The phenomenon of copycat correspondence created significant challenges for the investigation. Resources that might have been devoted to following up on physical evidence or conducting interviews had to be redirected to analysing hundreds of letters, most of which provided no useful information while consuming valuable time and attention. The police found themselves in the unprecedented position of having to develop expertise in document analysis and psychological assessment in order to manage the flood of written material. Newspaper editors faced their own dilemmas regarding how much attention to give to the correspondence phenomenon. Publishing excerpts from letters that claimed to be from the killer clearly increased circulation and public interest, but it also encouraged more hoax letters and potentially interfered with police investigations. The line between legitimate journalism and sensationalism became increasingly difficult to define as the story continued to evolve in unexpected directions. By November, the letter-writing phenomenon had taken on a life of its own, largely independent of the actual murders that had originally inspired it. The act of writing to newspapers or police claiming to be the Whitechapel killer had become a form of public participation in the ongoing drama, a way for individuals across Britain to insert themselves into a story that had captured the national imagination in ways that nobody could have predicted when the first body was discovered in Bucks Row. Chapter 3. Suspects in the Gaslight. In the narrow streets of Whitechapel, where dozens of languages could be heard within a single block, and where families from across Eastern Europe had come seeking safety and opportunity, Aaron Kosminski lived a life that intersected with the Ripper investigation in ways that would fascinate researchers for more than a century. Born in Poland around 1865, he had arrived in London during the 1880s as part of the great wave of Jewish immigration that was transforming the demographics and culture of the East End. Kosminski worked as a hairdresser, a trade that required steady hands and attention to detail, and which brought him into daily contact with razors and other sharp instruments that would later seem significant to investigators examining the precision of the Ripper's work. His shop was located in the heart of the area where the murders occurred, and his work schedule meant that he was often moving through the district during the early morning hours when several of the crimes took place. Those who knew Kosminski during the period of the murders described a man who seemed increasingly troubled by fears and anxieties that he couldn't clearly articulate. His behavior became erratic in ways that worried his family and neighbors, though the specific nature of his distress remained unclear. He spoke of hearing voices that others couldn't detect and developed obsessive concerns about food and cleanliness that interfered with his ability to maintain normal social relationships. The suspicion that would eventually fall on Kosminski didn't emerge immediately after the murders, but developed gradually as investigators continued to pursue leads and evaluate evidence years after the crimes had apparently ceased. His name first appeared in police files not as a suspect in the Ripper case, but in connection with other minor incidents that brought him to the attention of local constables who were maintaining detailed records of anyone in the district whose behavior seemed unusual or potentially threatening. Inspector Abberline, in his later years, would speak carefully about Kosminski, acknowledging that circumstances had made him a person of interest, while avoiding any definitive statements about his guilt or innocence. The inspector's approach reflected the professional caution of an experienced investigator who understood the difference between reasonable suspicion and proof sufficient for prosecution. Kosminski remained one of several individuals who couldn't be eliminated from consideration, but for whom no compelling evidence existed. The case against Kosminski was largely circumstantial, built on a foundation of opportunity local knowledge and behavioral changes that might have been connected to the murders, or might have reflected entirely unrelated mental health issues. He lived and worked in the immediate area where the crimes occurred, possessed skills that might have contributed to the apparent surgical precision of the wounds, and exhibited psychological disturbances that seemed to intensify around the time of the murders. Medical experts who later examined the available information about Kosminski's mental state found it difficult to reach any definitive conclusions about his psychological condition during the relevant period. The understanding of mental illness in the 1880s was limited, and the records that survived from his eventual institutionalization provided only fragmentary insights into his internal experience during the months when the Ripper was active. What made Kosminski particularly interesting to investigators was not just his proximity to the crimes, but his apparent knowledge of the area's geography and social patterns. As someone who had lived and worked in Whitechapel for several years, he would have understood the rhythms of street life, known which areas were likely to be deserted during particular hours, and been familiar with the network of alleys and courtyards that provided the killer with routes of approach and escape. The immigrant community's relationship with the police was complex during this period, shaped by experiences of persecution in Eastern Europe and uncertainty about their status in British society. Many families were reluctant to provide information to investigators, not because they were protecting criminals, but because they feared that any involvement with official authorities might threaten their tenuous position in their adopted country. This made it difficult for police to gather comprehensive information about individuals like Kosminski, who lived within these tight-knit communities. Montague, John Druitt, lived a life that spanned multiple worlds in late Victorian London, moving between the respectable professional circles of the legal establishment and the private struggles that would eventually make him a subject of intense speculation in connection with the Ripper murders. Born into a middle-class family in Dorset, educated at Winchester College and Oxford University, he represented the kind of educated professional that Victorian society expected to provide moral leadership and social stability. Druitt's career as a barrister was competent but unremarkable. The kind of solid professional achievement that provided financial security and social respectability without bringing particular distinction or notoriety. He maintained chambers in London and took on the variety of legal work that sustained most practitioners of his generation, handling commercial disputes, property matters, and the occasional criminal case that required representation for defendants who could afford private counsel. Parallel to his legal career, Druitt taught at a boarding school in Blackheath, where he was responsible for instructing young men from affluent families in classical subjects and contemporary academic disciplines. Colleagues and students who knew him during this period described a man who fulfilled his professional responsibilities adequately while maintaining the reserve and dignity expected of someone in his position. There were no obvious signs of the psychological disturbance that some later investigators would theorize might have driven him to commit acts of extreme violence. The suspicion that would eventually attach to Druitt's name emerged not from contemporary police investigations, but from comments made years later by officials who had been involved in the case. The most significant of these was a memorandum written by Sir Melville Macnaghten, who joined the Metropolitan Police as Assistant Chief Constable in 1889, after the canonical Ripper murders had ceased. Macnaghten's private notes, never intended for public circulation, identified Druitt as the most likely suspect based on information that was never fully explained or documented. What made Druitt particularly interesting to later investigators was the timing of his death, which occurred in December 1888, shortly after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, which most experts consider to be the final canonical Ripper killing his body, was found in the Thames several weeks after he had apparently committed suicide, though the specific circumstances and motivation for his decision to end his life remained unclear to his family and associates. The geographical aspects of Druitt's connection to the case were less straightforward than those of other suspects. Unlike Kosminski, who lived and worked in the immediate area where the murders occurred, Druitt's known addresses and professional obligations would have required him to travel to Whitechapel specifically to commit the crimes. This raised questions about his familiarity with the area and his ability to move through it. Undetected, though supporters of the theory argued that his legal work might have brought him into contact with the East End's social services and court system. Contemporary records provided little insight into Druitt's personal life or psychological state during the period when the murders occurred. His professional colleagues noted no obvious changes in his behavior or demeanor. Though the Victorian emphasis on personal privacy and professional discretion meant that significant internal struggles might have gone unnoticed by casual acquaintances. The boarding school where he taught reported no unusual incidents or concerns about his conduct with students or other staff members. The medical evidence that would later be cited in support of the Druitt theory was largely speculative, based on assumptions about his educational background rather than any documented knowledge of anatomy or surgical techniques. His Oxford education would have included exposure to various academic disciplines, though there was no evidence that he had pursued medical studies or gained practical experience with surgical instruments. Family members, who might have provided insights into Druitt's mental state and personal circumstances during the relevant period, maintained a discretion that was typical of Victorian middle-class families faced with scandal or tragedy. The stigma associated with suicide was considerable during this era, and any connection to the Ripper murders would have been devastating to relatives trying to preserve their social standing and professional relationships. Among the various theories that emerged to explain the Whitechapel murders, none captured public imagination quite like the suggestions that members of the British royal family or individuals acting to protect royal interests might have been involved in the crimes. These theories, which would eventually be dismissed by serious investigators, nevertheless revealed fascinating aspects of late Victorian attitudes toward authority privilege and the relationship between different social classes in London society. The most persistent of these theories centred around Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, who would later become King Edward VII. Prince Eddie, as he was known to family and close associates, was a young man whose private life had occasionally been the subject of whispered speculation among those who moved in royal circles, though nothing in the official records suggested any connection to criminal activity of any kind. The royal conspiracy theories typically involved elaborate scenarios in which the murders were committed either by the prince himself, driven by some form of mental illness or moral corruption, or by agents acting to cover up embarrassing associations or illegitimate relationships that might threaten the stability of the monarchy. These theories required complex networks of official complicity and cover-ups that would have involved dozens of individuals across multiple government departments and social institutions. Inspector Abberline and his colleagues were required to investigate these allegations with the same thoroughness they brought to other aspects of the case, though they did so with considerable skepticism about the likelihood that such theories would prove credible. The logistics alone of royal involvement seemed implausible when subjected to careful analysis. The movements of members of the royal family were extensively documented and monitored, making it extremely difficult for any of them to have been present in Whitechapel during the times when the murders occurred. More fundamentally, the royal conspiracy theories misunderstood the nature of the crimes themselves. The Ripper murders were characterized by their intimate personal quality, the kind of violence that suggested direct physical and psychological involvement by the perpetrator. The idea that such acts could have been committed by proxy or as part of some broader institutional cover-up failed to account for the specific psychological signatures that forensic experts had identified in the crime scenes. The official response to royal conspiracy theories was characterized by the kind of dignified dismissal that Victorian institutions typically employed when dealing with speculation that they considered beneath serious consideration. Palace officials, when pressed by journalists or investigators, provided documentary evidence of royal schedules and whereabouts that effectively eliminated any possibility of direct involvement by members of the immediate royal family detective work that might have been devoted to pursuing more promising leads was necessarily diverted to investigating these theories thoroughly enough to demonstrate their implausibility. This represented one of the costs of the intense public interest in the case. The way that spectacular theories could consume investigative resources, even when they were based on speculation rather than evidence. The persistence of royal conspiracy theories revealed interesting aspects of public psychology during the late Victorian period. The idea that the highest levels of society might be connected to the most depraved forms of criminal behavior seemed to satisfy a particular need to believe that privilege and respectability might be masks for corruption. This reflected broader social tensions about class inequality and the accountability of powerful institutions. Medical experts who were consulted about the psychological profiles that might be associated with the murders consistently concluded that the crimes showed characteristics of personal compulsion rather than political or institutional motivation. The ritualistic aspects of the violence, the apparent escalation in severity, and the intimate nature of the wounds all suggested someone acting to satisfy internal psychological needs rather than external political or social objectives. By 1890, serious investigators had quietly but definitively eliminated royal conspiracy theories from active consideration, though they continued to surface periodically in popular speculation and sensational journalism. The careful documentation of royal activities during the relevant periods, combined with the psychological profile that was emerging from analysis of the crimes themselves, made it clear that these theories, however fascinating to the public imagination, had no basis in factual evidence. Chapter 4. The Medical Mind. Dr. Thomas Bond, brought 30 years of medical experience to his examination of the Whitechapel murder victims, applying the most advanced forensic techniques available in late Victorian London to crimes that would challenge every aspect of contemporary understanding about violent psychology and criminal investigation. As consulting surgeon to the Metropolitan Police, Bond had examined hundreds of bodies under circumstances that ranged from simple accidents to complex criminal cases. But nothing in his extensive career had prepared him for the particular challenges presented by the Ripper murders. The post-mortem examination of Mary Jane Kelly, conducted in the small room where her body had been discovered in Miller's Court, required Bond to work under conditions that were far from ideal for detailed forensic analysis. The November morning was cold and grey, the light filtering through the single window insufficient for the careful work that needed to be done. Despite these limitations, Bond approached his task with the methodical precision that had made him one of London's most respected medical examiners, understanding that his observations might provide crucial insights into the mind and methods of the killer. What struck Bond most forcefully during his examination was the combination of extreme violence with evident anatomical knowledge. The wounds had been inflicted with surgical precision, suggesting someone who understood human anatomy well enough to work efficiently, even under the stressful conditions that would have accompanied the commission of such crimes. At the same time, the extent and nature of the mutilations indicated a level of psychological disturbance that went far beyond anything Bond had encountered in his previous forensic work. The instruments used in the murders appeared to be medical or surgical in nature, sharp enough to make clean incisions and steady enough to work through various types of tissue without breaking or becoming damaged. Bond's analysis suggested that the killer possessed not just theoretical knowledge of anatomy, but practical experience in using surgical instruments under challenging conditions. This pointed towards someone with medical training, though not necessarily someone who had completed formal medical education or worked in established medical institutions. Bond's written reports, which would become crucial documents for future investigators, attempted to balance clinical objectivity with the practical needs of criminal investigation. He described the wounds in precise medical terminology, while also offering interpretations about what they might reveal regarding the killer's psychological state and technical capabilities. These reports represented some of the earliest attempts to combine medical forensics with criminal psychology in British legal history. The timing and sequence of the wounds provided additional insights into the killer's methods, and mental state. Bond's analysis suggested that the murders had been committed with deliberate calculation rather than in frenzied attacks. The killer appeared to have worked methodically, taking time to arrange the bodies and inflict specific types of wounds that seemed to follow some internal logic or compulsion that remained invisible to outside observers. What troubled Bond most was the evidence that the killer had remained at the crime scenes for extended periods after the initial attacks, continuing to work on the bodies long after the victims had died. This suggested someone who was either remarkably confident about avoiding detection, or who was so consumed by whatever psychological compulsion drove him that he was willing to accept significant risks in order to complete his work according to his own internal requirements. The medical evidence also provided insights into the killer's physical characteristics and capabilities. The nature of the wounds suggested someone with considerable upper body strength and manual dexterity, capable of working quickly and efficiently under stressful conditions. The positioning of certain cuts indicated that the killer was probably right-handed and of average height or slightly taller. Though Bond cautioned that these conclusions were necessarily speculative. Bond's collaboration with other medical professionals involved in the case created an unprecedented level of scientific analysis for criminal investigations of this era. Doctors from across London contributed their expertise to understanding the medical aspects of the crimes, sharing knowledge about surgical techniques, anatomical training, and the psychological conditions that might produce such extreme forms of violence. The question of whether the Whitechapel killer possessed formal medical training became one of the most contentious aspects of the entire investigation, dividing medical professionals into camps that interpreted the same physical evidence in fundamentally different ways. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, who had conducted several of the initial post-mortem examinations, maintained that the precision and efficiency of the wounds demonstrated surgical expertise that could only have been acquired through years of formal medical education and practical training. Phillips pointed to specific aspects of the mutilations that he believed revealed advanced anatomical knowledge, particularly the killer's apparent ability to locate and remove specific organs quickly and efficiently, even while working in poor lighting conditions and under the psychological pressure that would have accompanied such crimes. The clean nature of many of the incisions, the apparent understanding of how to navigate around major blood vessels and bone structures, and the efficiency with which certain procedures had been completed, all suggested someone with considerable medical experience. Other physicians who examined the evidence reached different conclusions, arguing that the wounds, while certainly inflicted with sharp instruments, did not necessarily demonstrate the kind of sophisticated medical knowledge that Phillips had identified. Dr. Frederick Brown, who assisted with several of the examinations, suggested that the apparent surgical precision might have been the result of luck determination or practical experience gained through non-medical activities, such as butchering or other trades that required working with sharp tools on organic materials. The debate extended beyond the immediate circle of doctors involved in the official investigation, as medical professionals throughout London found themselves drawn into discussions about what level of training would be necessary to produce the types of wounds that had been documented. Medical journals published articles analysing the evidence, and medical societies held meetings where members could examine photographs and detailed descriptions of the injuries while offering their own professional assessments. Dr. Bond, whose extensive forensic experience gave his opinions particular weight, attempted to find middle ground in the debate by suggesting that the killer might have possessed some medical knowledge without necessarily having completed formal training as a physician or surgeon. He theorized that someone who had worked as a medical student, hospital attendant, or in some other capacity that provided exposure to human anatomy might have acquired sufficient knowledge to commit the murders with the apparent efficiency that had been documented. The implications of the medical skill debate extended far beyond academic questions about the killer's background and training. If the murderer was indeed a trained physician, the investigation would need to focus on members of the medical community, examining the backgrounds and activities of doctors, medical students, and hospital staff who had access to the East End during the relevant time periods. This would require unprecedented cooperation between police investigators and medical institutions that had traditionally maintained considerable autonomy and privacy. Hospital administrators and medical school officials found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to provide information about current and former staff members, students who had access to anatomical specimens and surgical instruments, and anyone whose behavior or psychological state might have raised concerns among colleagues or supervisors. This level of scrutiny was deeply disturbing to medical professionals who valued their professional reputation and personal privacy. The debate also raised broader questions about the relationship between medical knowledge and criminal behavior that challenged Victorian assumptions about education, social class, and moral character. The idea that someone with the training and social standing associated with medical practice might be capable of such extreme violence contradicted prevailing beliefs about the civilizing effects of education and professional achievement. Some medical professionals argued that the stress and psychological demands of medical training and practice might actually increase the likelihood of mental breakdown or moral corruption, particularly among individuals who were already predisposed to psychological instability. They pointed to the fact that medical practitioners were regularly exposed to death suffering and the intimate details of human anatomy in ways that might desensitize them to violence or provide inspiration for disturbing fantasies. Others maintained that medical training properly conducted instilled ethical principles and professional obligations that would prevent any genuinely qualified physician from engaging in criminal behavior. They argued that someone capable of the Ripper murders would have revealed psychological disturbances during medical training that would have prevented them from completing their education or gaining access to the surgical skills that the crimes appeared to require. The attempt to understand the psychological characteristics of the Whitechapel killer represented one of the earliest systematic efforts to apply emerging theories about criminal psychology to active police investigations. Dr. L. Forbes Winslow, one of London's most prominent alienists, approached the task with considerable enthusiasm, believing that the new scientific understanding of mental illness and criminal behaviour might provide insights that traditional investigative methods had failed to produce. Winslow's analysis began with the assumption that the Ripper murders represented a form of behaviour that was fundamentally different from conventional criminal activity. The apparent lack of financial motivation, the ritualistic aspects of the violence, and the killer's apparent compulsion to continue, despite increasing police attention, all suggested someone driven by internal psychological forces, rather than external circumstances or rational decision-making processes. The Victorian understanding of mental illness was limited by the theoretical frameworks and diagnostic categories available during the 1880s, but Winslow and his colleagues attempted to apply contemporary knowledge about conditions such as moral insanity, homicidal mania, and what would later be understood as psychopathic personality disorders. They were particularly interested in the killer's apparent ability to function normally in social situations while harboring such extreme violent impulses. The letters that claimed to be from the killer provided additional material for psychological analysis, offering insights into the perpetrator's thought processes, self-perception, and relationship with the broader public. Winslow noted the grandiose tone of much of the correspondence, the apparent pleasure the writer took in his notoriety, and the way he seemed to view the murders as a form of artistic or professional achievement, worthy of public recognition and admiration. What emerged from these early profiling attempts was a portrait of someone who combined rational planning abilities with complete moral detachment, someone who could analyze situations strategically while remaining emotionally disconnected from the human consequences of his actions. This psychological profile would prove remarkably prescient when compared to modern understanding of serial killer psychology, though the Victorian theoretical framework limited the sophistication of the analysis that could be conducted at the time. The geographic pattern of the murders provided additional psychological insights, suggesting someone who felt comfortable and confident operating within a specific area of London while avoiding detection by local residents and police patrols. This implied not just familiarity with the physical geography of Whitechapel, but understanding of its social geography as well, knowledge of when and where people were likely to be present, and which locations would provide the privacy necessary for extended criminal activity. Winslow and other alienists were particularly struck by the apparent escalation in the severity and complexity of the murders over time, which they interpreted as evidence of a progressive psychological condition that was becoming more extreme and elaborate as the killer gained experience and confidence. This pattern suggested someone who was not simply repeating identical crimes, but who was experimenting and developing his methods according to some internal logic or aesthetic principle. The relationship between the killer and his victims also provided material for psychological analysis. The fact that all the canonical victims were women from the East End's most vulnerable population suggested someone who targeted individuals who were unlikely to be missed quickly by family or friends, and whose disappearances would not immediately generate intensive police investigations. This indicated strategic thinking about risk management and victim selection that went beyond random or opportunistic criminal behaviour. The timing of the murders, concentrated into a relatively brief period and then apparently ceasing altogether, presented additional psychological puzzles. Winslow theorized that the killer might have satisfied whatever internal compulsion drove him to commit the crimes, moved away from London, been institutionalized for mental illness, or died by suicide or other means. Each of these possibilities implied different psychological trajectories and different types of mental disturbance. The public nature of the killer's communication through letters and the apparent pleasure he took in media attention suggested someone who viewed the murders as a form of performance art, a way of establishing a relationship with London society through the medium of newspaper coverage and public speculation. This indicated a level of narcissism and need for recognition that went beyond the simple desire to avoid detection that characterized most criminal behavior. Chapter 5: Streets of Memory. The cobblestones of Durward Street, once known as Bucks Row, still bear the weight of history beneath the footsteps of those who walk them today. Though few passers-by pause to consider the events that unfolded here on that August morning in 1888. The narrow thoroughfare, squeezed between rows of Victorian terraced houses, maintains much of its original character, despite more than a century of urban change and renewal that has transformed so much of London's East End. Standing at the spot where Polly Nichols was discovered, one can almost feel the presence of Inspector Abberline as he knelt beside the body, making the careful observations that would launch one of history's most famous criminal investigations. The gaslight that once cast dancing shadows on brick walls has been replaced by electric street lamps, but the essential geometry of the space remains unchanged. The same narrow passage between buildings that provided the killer with both access and concealment. The residents who lived in the houses that lined Bucks Row during those troubled months have long since passed away. But their descendants sometimes speak of family stories passed down through generations. Fragments of memory about the fear that settled over the neighborhood like fog. The way ordinary routines changed as people became aware that something unprecedented was stalking their streets. These personal histories, never recorded in official documents, provide insights into the human experience of living through events that would eventually become the subject of scholarly analysis and popular fascination. Walking east toward Whitechapel Road, following the route that the killer might have taken after committing his first canonical murder, one passes buildings that have witnessed more than a century of social and economic change. The Jewish immigrants who once filled these streets have been replaced by successive waves of newcomers from Bangladesh, Somalia, and other parts of the world, where poverty and persecution have driven people to seek new lives in London's East End. The geometry of fear that characterized Whitechapel in 1888 can still be traced in the network of narrow alleys and courtyards that provided the killer with multiple routes of approach and escape. Dorset Street, once considered the most dangerous thoroughfare in London, has been renamed and redeveloped, but the fundamental pattern of the street layout remains recognizable to anyone who studies contemporary maps and compares them to the detailed surveys that Victorian police investigators used to analyze the killer's movements. Hanbury Street, where Annie Chapman was discovered in the backyard of number 29, retains the cramped, intimate character that made it both attractive to someone seeking privacy for criminal activity and terrifying to residents who realized how close violence had come to their own homes. The building where Chapman died has been demolished and replaced, but the narrow passage that leads to the courtyard where her body was found still exists, still provides the same sense of isolation from the busy street just yards away. The walk from Hanbury Street to Berner Street, where Elizabeth Stride was killed, traces a path through the heart of the area that the Ripper claimed as his territory. This was a journey that any resident of the district might have made in the course of ordinary daily activities, passing familiar shops and pubs, nodding to neighbours, moving through a landscape that was simultaneously public and intimate, known and dangerous Mitre Square, where Catherine Eddowes was murdered just minutes after Stride's. Death represents the boldest and most mysterious aspect of the killer's activities. The decision to commit a second murder on the same night in a location that required significant travel from the first crime scene suggested someone who possessed not just detailed knowledge of East End geography, but confidence in his ability to move through the area without detection even after police had been alerted to his activities. The final canonical murder site, Miller's Court, where Mary Jane Kelly was killed in her own room, has been completely transformed by urban redevelopment, but the narrow entrance to the courtyard, barely wide enough for two people to pass, still conveys something of the claustrophobic atmosphere that characterized much of Victorian Whitechapel. This was a place where privacy could be purchased cheaply, where people could disappear from view and attention in ways that would be difficult to achieve in more affluent areas of London. The Ten Bells Public House stands today, much as it did in 1888, its Victorian facade and etched glass windows serving as a tangible link to the world that Jack the Ripper knew and navigated. Located at the corner of Commercial Street and Fournier Street, the pub occupied a central position in the social geography of Whitechapel, serving as a meeting place, refuge, and informal community centre for residents of one of London's most densely populated and economically challenged neighbourhoods. During the autumn of 1888, the 10 Bells drew customers from across the social spectrum of East End life. Dock workers would stop for a quick drink before or after their shifts. Seamstresses and factory workers would gather to share news and gossip, and the neighbourhood's population of street vendors, casual labourers, and others who made their living from the informal economy would use the pub as a place to conduct business, share information about employment opportunities, and maintain the social connections that were essential for survival in a precarious economic environment. Several of the Ripper's victims were known to frequent the 10 Bells not as regular customers, in the way that term might be understood in more affluent neighbourhoods, but as part of the floating population of people who used public houses as temporary refugees from the cold, wet weather that characterised London autumns, and as places where they might encounter potential customers for the various services they provided to earn money for food and lodging. Annie Chapman had been seen in the pub on occasions before her death, sometimes in the company of other women who worked the streets of Whitechapel, sometimes alone, nursing a drink and watching the flow of customers with the particular attention that people in desperate circumstances bring to assessing opportunities and risks. The conversations she might have had, the people she met, the impressions she formed about strangers who appeared in the pub during those crucial weeks, all represent information that died with her and was never available to investigators trying to piece together the killer's methods and movements. Mary Jane Kelly, the final canonical victim, had stronger connections to the 10 Bells than some of the other murdered women. Younger and more attractive than most of her companions, she was remembered by the pub staff and regular customers as someone who could be charming and sociable, when circumstances permitted, though also prone to the kind of emotional volatility that often accompanied the stress and uncertainty of her living situation. The pub served as an informal information exchange where news travelled quickly through the community. During the weeks when the murders were occurring, conversations at the 10 Bells would have focused heavily on safety precautions, suspicious characters and theories about the killers, identity and methods. The regular customers, many of whom had lived in the area for years or decades, would have shared their observations about strangers, unusual activities and changes in the neighbourhoods, normal patterns of life. Bartenders and serving staff at establishments like the 10 Bells often developed remarkable knowledge about their customers, personal lives, financial situations, and social connections. They were positioned to observe who was drinking, with whom, who was spending money they couldn't normally afford, who was exhibiting unusual behaviour or expressing disturbing ideas. This made them potentially valuable sources of information for police investigators, though the informal nature of their observations and the class differences that separated them from the investigating officers sometimes made it difficult to communicate effectively. The physical layout of the 10 Bells, with its multiple rooms and corners where people could drink in relative privacy, would have provided opportunities for the kind of discreet conversations and planning that might have preceded the murders. Someone looking to identify potential victims, learn about their routines and vulnerabilities, or gather information about the neighbourhoods, geography and social patterns, could have done so simply by spending time in the pub and listening carefully to the conversations around him. The atmosphere in the 10 Bells during the autumn of 1888 would have been charged with the particular tension that develops in communities under threat. People would have been simultaneously drawn together by shared fear and driven apart by suspicion and uncertainty about who could be trusted. This psychological climate would have created both opportunities and challenges for someone planning criminal activities, providing cover for suspicious behaviour, while also increasing the likelihood that unusual activities would be noticed and remembered. After the murders ceased and the immediate fear began to subside, the 10 Bells became a place where the events of those terrible months were processed, remembered, and eventually transformed into the kind of local folklore that communities create to make sense of traumatic experiences that exceed their normal capacity for understanding. The transformation of Whitechapel in the months and years following the Ripper murders was both immediate and profound, affecting not just the physical security measures that residents adopted, but the fundamental social and psychological character of a community that had previously defined itself by its resilience in the face of poverty and hardship. The neighborhood that emerged from the crisis was recognizably the same place, but marked by changes that would influence its development for generations to come. The most obvious changes were practical and security-related. Women who had previously moved through the district with the kind of casual confidence that comes from intimate familiarity with one's surroundings began to travel in groups, arrange escort services for evening activities, and avoid areas that had previously been considered safe enough for solitary travel. These changes in behavior patterns had cascading effects throughout the community, altering work schedules, social activities, and the informal networks of mutual support that had helped residents cope with economic uncertainty. Local businesses adapted to the new security consciousness by extending their hours to provide safe gathering places, during the dangerous evening hours installing better lighting around their premises, and organizing informal watch systems that allowed merchants to keep track of unusual activities in their immediate neighborhoods. The 10 Bells and other public houses became unofficial community centers where people could stay together until daylight made travel safer, fundamentally changing the social dynamics of East End nightlife. The relationship between the Whitechapel community and the Metropolitan Police was permanently altered by the intensive investigation that followed the murders. Residents who had previously viewed police officers as outsiders with limited understanding of local conditions found themselves involved in an unprecedented level of cooperation with law enforcement officials who demonstrated genuine concern for their safety and well-being. This created lasting changes in attitudes toward authority and civic engagement that would influence the neighborhood's political development in subsequent decades. Media attention focused on Whitechapel during and after the murders brought the area to national and international attention in ways that had profound long-term consequences for its economic and social development. The sensational coverage that depicted the East End as a place of unrelieved poverty and danger attracted the attention of social reformers, religious organizations, and political activists who launched initiatives aimed at improving living conditions and expanding opportunities for residents. The murders also accelerated changes that were already beginning to transform the ethnic and cultural composition of the neighborhood. The intense scrutiny that fell on the area's immigrant communities, particularly the Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, created pressures that encouraged some families to relocate to other parts of London, where they could live with less visibility and suspicion. At the same time, the publicity surrounding the murders made Whitechapel a symbol of urban social problems that attracted new waves of immigrants and social activists, who were drawn to the area specifically because of its reputation. Housing conditions in Whitechapel improved significantly in the years following the murders, partly as a result of increased public attention to the connection between poverty and crime, and partly because of specific reform initiatives that were launched in response to the crisis. The common lodging houses that had provided cheap but dangerous accommodation for the most vulnerable residents were gradually replaced or improved, reducing some of the environmental factors that had made the area attractive to someone planning violent crimes. The psychological impact of the murders on the community was more difficult to measure, but equally significant. Residents who had lived through the terror of those autumn months carried with them a heightened awareness of vulnerability and a changed relationship with their physical environment that influenced their behavior and attitudes for the rest of their lives. Children who had grown up during the crisis developed different assumptions about safety and danger than their parents had possessed, creating generational changes in community culture and social behavior. The legend of Jack the Ripper became a permanent part of Whitechapel's identity, attracting tourists, researchers, and curiosity seekers who contributed to the local economy, while also serving as constant reminders of the area's most notorious period. This dual legacy of trauma and fascination created complex relationships between long-term residents who had lived through the actual events and newcomers who were drawn to the area by its historical associations. The institutional changes that resulted from the Ripper investigation had lasting effects on criminal investigation methods throughout London and beyond. The systematic approach to evidence collection, witness interviews, and interagency cooperation that had been developed during the search for the killer became standard operating procedures that influenced police work for decades to come. representing one of the few positive legacies of those terrible months. Chapter 6. The Final Years. Inspector Frederick Abberline closed his final case file on a grey December morning in 1892, 30 years after he had first walked the beat as a young constable learning the rhythms and secrets of London's East End. The leather-bound ledger that contained his notes on the Whitechapel murders sat among dozens of other completed investigations. But even in retirement, it remained the case that would define his professional legacy and personal reflections on the nature of police work in an increasingly complex urban environment. The years following the canonical murders had been marked by a gradual shift in public attention away from the Ripper case and toward other criminal matters that seemed more amenable to conventional investigative methods. Abberline had continued to receive occasional reports of suspicious activities, potential leads and theories from members of the public who remained convinced that the killer was still active or that crucial evidence had been overlooked. But none of these communications had produced actionable intelligence or significant new developments. In his private moments sitting in the small study of his Bournemouth home, where he had settled after leaving London, Abberline would sometimes take out the case files and review the evidence that he and his colleagues had so carefully assembled during those intense months of investigation. The photographs, witness statements, medical reports, and correspondence that filled the folders represented thousands of hours of meticulous police work. Yet they had failed to produce the resolution that he had hoped to provide to the victims' families and the frightened community that had looked to him for answers and justice. The inspector's reflections on the case were characterized by a professional frustration, tempered by realistic acceptance of the limitations that had constrained the investigation. The scientific methods available for analyzing physical evidence in the 1880s had been primitive by the standards that would develop in later decades. Witness testimony had been limited by the social marginalization of the people most likely to have observed relevant activities, and the killer's apparent understanding of police procedures had enabled him to avoid the kinds of mistakes that typically led to the resolution of criminal cases. Abberline's correspondence with former colleagues and medical professionals who had been involved in the investigation reveals a man who remained intellectually engaged with the case long after his official responsibilities had ended. He followed developments in criminal psychology and forensic science with the hope that new theoretical frameworks or technical capabilities might eventually provide insights that had been unavailable during the original investigation, though he was realistic about the likelihood that such advances would resolve a case that had grown cold decades earlier. The retired inspector was frequently approached by journalists, writers, and amateur investigators who hoped that he might share confidential information or private theories that hadn't been included in the official police reports. Abberline's responses to these inquiries were uniformly professional and discreet, acknowledging the legitimate public interest in the case while maintaining the confidentiality that had been essential to the original investigation and that remained necessary to protect the privacy of witnesses and the integrity of police procedures. In his later years, Abberline developed a particular interest in the psychological aspects of the case that had been least understood during the original investigation. He corresponded with alienists and medical professionals who were developing new theories about criminal behavior and mental illness, sharing his observations about the killers, apparent methods, and personality characteristics, while learning about theoretical frameworks that might help explain the motivations and compulsions that had driven someone to commit such extraordinary crimes. The inspector's assessment of the investigation's successes and failures was nuanced and self-reflective, acknowledging both the unprecedented challenges that the case had presented and the limitations of late Victorian police procedures when applied to a fundamentally new type of criminal behavior. He took particular pride in the systematic approach that he and his colleagues had developed for managing complex investigations involving multiple jurisdictions, extensive media attention, and public pressure for rapid resolution. Abberline's personal relationships with the victims, families, and community members who had been affected by the murders continued long after his retirement, reflecting the deep human connections that had developed during those months when he had served as the public face of the investigation. He maintained correspondence with several individuals who had provided assistance during the original inquiry, following their lives and careers with the kind of personal interest that reflected his genuine concern for the welfare of the people he had served. The murder of Francis Coles on February 13, 1891 in Swallow Gardens, beneath a railway arch, brought Inspector Abberline back into active involvement with what might have been another chapter in the Ripper case, though by this time both he and his colleagues approached such possibilities with considerably more caution and skepticism than they had brought to the canonical murders of 1888. The 3 years that had passed since Mary Jane Kelly's death had been marked by numerous false alarms and spurious reports that had trained investigators to distinguish between crimes that genuinely resembled the Ripper's work and those that merely shared superficial characteristics. Coles had been discovered by Police Constable Ernest Thompson during his routine patrol. Her throat cut, but her body otherwise unmutilated in the elaborate fashion that had characterized the canonical murders. The location was consistent with the Ripper's apparent preferences for semi-secluded spaces that provided both privacy and multiple escape routes, but the nature of the wounds suggested either a different perpetrator or a significant change in the killer's methods and psychological state. The investigation of the Coles murder was complicated by the arrest of Thomas Sadler, a merchant seaman who had been seen with the victim earlier in the evening and whose behavior after the discovery of the body had aroused suspicion among local residents and police officers. Sadler's case became a test of the investigative methods that had been developed during the Ripper inquiry, as investigators attempted to determine whether they were dealing with a conventional murder that could be solved through traditional police work, or another example of the unprecedented criminal behavior that had terrorized. Whitechapel Abberline's analysis of the Coles case reflected the accumulated wisdom of his years investigating the canonical murders, but also his awareness that public and official pressure to resolve the Ripper mystery might influence judgment about crimes that bore any resemblance to the earlier pattern. His approach was characterized by careful attention to the physical evidence, systematic interviews with witnesses, and skeptical evaluation of theories that attempted to connect the new murder to the unsolved cases from 1888. The medical examination of Coles' body, conducted by Dr. Oxley, revealed wounds that were consistent with attack by someone using a sharp knife, but lacked the surgical precision and anatomical knowledge that had distinguished the canonical Ripper murders. This suggested either that the killer's skills had deteriorated significantly, that he was working under different psychological and practical constraints, or that the murder had been committed by someone else entirely. Witness testimony in the Coles case proved more extensive and reliable than had been available for most of the canonical murders, partly because the crime had occurred in a more heavily trafficked area, and partly because the investigation benefited from improved police procedures and community relationships that had been developed during the earlier cases. Several individuals were able to provide detailed descriptions of people they had seen in the area around the time of the murder, though none of these descriptions clearly matched the limited physical profile that had been developed for the Ripper. The arrest and interrogation of Thomas Sadler provided investigators with an opportunity to test their understanding of the psychological characteristics that might be associated with the Whitechapel murders. Sadler's background behavior and responses to questioning were compared to the theoretical profile that had been developed for the Ripper, though the limitations of Victorian criminal psychology made it difficult to reach definitive conclusions about whether he might have been responsible for some or all of the earlier crimes. Ultimately, the evidence against Sadler proved insufficient to support a murder conviction, and he was released after several weeks in custody. His case illustrated both the progress that had been made in criminal investigation procedures since 1888 and the continuing challenges involved in solving crimes that lacked clear physical evidence or reliable witness testimony. The failure to connect the Coles murder definitively to either Sadler or the Ripper represented a frustrating conclusion to what many observers hoped might finally provide resolution to the mystery. The gradual recognition that the trail had gone cold was a process that unfolded over months, rather than occurring at any single dramatic moment. Reports of suspicious activities continued to arrive at police stations throughout the East End. Amateur investigators continued to propose new theories and identify potential suspects, and journalists continued to write articles suggesting that new evidence might finally solve the case, but none of these developments produced the breakthrough that had seemed possible during the height of the original investigation. The gradual healing of London's collective psyche from the trauma of the Ripper murders was a process that unfolded over years rather than months, marked not by any single moment of resolution or closure, but by the slow accumulation of ordinary days in which life continued without the shadow of fear that had dominated the autumn of 1888. The city that emerged from this period of terror was subtly but permanently changed, carrying within its institutional memory and cultural consciousness lessons about vulnerability, resilience, and the complex relationship between urban civilization and the primitive forces that can threaten it. The most visible sign of recovery was the gradual return to normal patterns of nighttime activity in the East End, as women resumed working and socializing after dark families allowed their children to play in areas that had been considered too dangerous during the height of the crisis, and the network of informal social gatherings that characterized working-class community life slowly re-established itself. This process was facilitated by the passage of time without additional murders, but also by deliberate community efforts to reclaim public spaces and restore the sense of shared security that had been shattered by the killer's activities. Religious and charitable organizations played crucial roles in helping East End residents process their experiences and move beyond the trauma that had disrupted their lives for so many months. Churches that had served as refuges during the crisis continued to provide counseling and support services, while social reformers who had been drawn to the area by the publicity surrounding the murders established programs aimed at addressing the underlying conditions of poverty and social isolation that had made the community vulnerable to such predatory behavior. The Metropolitan Police institutionalized many of the investigative innovations that had been developed during the Ripper case, creating new procedures for managing complex criminal investigations, coordinating between different divisions and jurisdictions, and maintaining systematic records that could support long-term investigative efforts. These changes represented one of the few positive legacies of the terrible events, contributing to improved law enforcement capabilities that would benefit London residents for decades to come. Newspaper coverage of crime and criminal investigation was permanently altered by the Ripper case, as editors and reporters discovered both the commercial potential and the social responsibility associated with covering violent crime in densely populated urban areas. The sensational journalism that had characterized much of the coverage during 1888 gradually gave way to more thoughtful approaches that balanced public interest with concern for community welfare and respect for victims' families. The international attention that the murders had focused on London's East End continued to influence the area's development long after the killer had disappeared from the scene. Social reformers from across Europe and America visited Whitechapel to study the conditions that had provided the context for such extraordinary crimes, leading to comparative research projects and reform initiatives that connected local improvement efforts to broader movements for urban social reform. The medical and scientific communities that had been involved in the investigation continued to develop the forensic techniques and psychological theories that had emerged from their attempts to understand the killer's methods and motivations. While the Ripper case itself remained unsolved, the intellectual frameworks that had been created to analyze it contributed to advances in criminal psychology, forensic medicine, and investigative procedures that would prove valuable. In future cases, educational institutions began incorporating case studies based on the Ripper investigation into their curricula for students training in law enforcement medicine and social work, ensuring that the lessons learned during those difficult months would be transmitted to future generations of professionals who might encounter similar challenges. This academic legacy helped transform a local tragedy into a resource for understanding and preventing similar crimes in other times and places. The transformation of the Ripper story into folklore and popular culture began almost immediately after the murders ceased, as the combination of mystery, fear, and fascination that had characterized public response to the crimes evolved into the kind of enduring narrative that communities create to make sense of experiences that exceed normal understanding. This cultural processing of the trauma served important psychological functions for London residents, while also establishing patterns of commemoration and interpretation that would influence how future generations understood the events. Most significantly, London's recovery from the Ripper murders demonstrated the remarkable resilience of urban communities when faced with threats that seemed to challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying civilized life. The city's ability to absorb the shock of unprecedented criminal behavior, adapt its institutions and procedures to address new forms of danger, and eventually integrate the experience into its ongoing narrative of progress and development, became a model for how modern societies could respond to similar crises. Chapter 7. Modern Revelations. The application of DNA analysis to artifacts from the Jack the Ripper case represents one of the most intriguing intersections between Victorian criminal investigation and 21st century forensic science, offering the tantalizing possibility that questions which had puzzled investigators for more than a century might finally yield to technological capabilities that were unimaginable during the original inquiry. The preservation of letters, clothing fragments, and other physical evidence in police archives and private collections created a unique opportunity for modern researchers to examine the case using scientific methods that could potentially identify the killer's biological signature. Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist at Liverpool, John Moores University, became one of the most prominent figures in the effort to extract DNA evidence from Ripper-related artifacts when he gained access to a shawl that was claimed to have been found at the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder. The shawl, which had been passed down through the family of Police Constable Amos Simpson, contained what appeared to be bloodstains and other biological material that had been preserved under conditions that might have maintained sufficient genetic material for modern analysis. The technical challenges involved in extracting usable DNA from Victorian-era artifacts were formidable, requiring sophisticated laboratory techniques and careful contamination control procedures to distinguish between genetic material that might have originated from the killer and the numerous individuals who had handled the evidence during the intervening decades. The degradation that naturally occurs in biological samples over long periods of time meant that even successful DNA extraction would likely yield only partial genetic profiles that might not be sufficient for definitive identification. Louhelainen's analysis of the shawl focused on mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through the maternal line and tends to be more stable over time than nuclear DNA. His results suggested genetic sequences that could be compared to samples from descendants of individuals who had been considered suspects in the original investigation, creating the possibility of either eliminating certain candidates or providing support for theories that had been based on circumstantial evidence. The most publicized aspect of this DNA research involved attempts to confirm or refute the long-standing suspicion surrounding Aaron Kosminski, whose descendants were located and asked to provide saliva samples that could be compared to genetic material extracted from the Victorian artifacts. The initial results suggested a possible match between mitochondrial DNA from the shawl and genetic samples from Kosminski's family line, though the statistical significance and reliability of this finding remained subjects of considerable scientific debate. Critical evaluation of the DNA evidence revealed numerous methodological concerns that complicated attempts to draw definitive conclusions from the research. The chain of custody for the shawl and other artifacts could not be established with sufficient certainty to eliminate the possibility of contamination from modern sources. The partial nature of the genetic profiles made statistical analysis problematic, and the techniques used for comparison were challenged by other researchers who questioned both the methodology and the interpretation of results. Independent attempts to replicate and verify the DNA findings encountered significant obstacles, partly because access to the original artifacts was limited, and partly because the degraded nature of the genetic material made consistent results difficult to achieve. Several research teams that attempted similar analyses of other Ripper-related evidence produced results that were either inconclusive or inconsistent, with the initial findings raising questions about the reliability of DNA evidence from such old and potentially contaminated sources. The controversy surrounding DNA analysis of Ripper evidence highlighted broader issues about the application of modern forensic techniques to historical criminal cases, including questions about appropriate standards of evidence, the responsibility of researchers to acknowledge limitations and uncertainties, and the potential for scientific analysis to be influenced by the desire to solve famous mysteries, rather than by purely objective investigative goals. Despite these limitations, the DNA research represented a significant advance in the scientific analysis of the Ripper case, demonstrating both the potential and the constraints associated with applying cutting-edge forensic techniques to Victorian criminal evidence. The work established protocols and methodologies that could be applied to other historical cases, while also providing insights into the challenges involved in extracting reliable conclusions from degraded biological samples. The public response to claims about DNA evidence in the Ripper case revealed the continued fascination with the mystery and the powerful appeal of scientific solutions to historical puzzles, while also illustrating the difficulty of communicating complex technical findings to non-specialist audiences who might not fully understand the limitations and uncertainties inherent in such research. The discovery of previously unknown documents related to the Jack the Ripper investigation has been an ongoing process that has continued to provide new insights into the case. More than a century after the murders occurred, as archives are digitized, private collections are made public, and researchers develop new strategies for locating and analyzing historical materials that might shed light on the investigation or the social context in which it took place. One of the most significant archival discoveries came in 1975, when Stuart Evans, a retired police officer turned Ripper researcher, located the private papers of Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who had been in overall charge of the investigation. Among Swanson's personal effects were annotated copies of official reports and memoirs that contained handwritten notes identifying Aaron Kosminski as the prime suspect, providing documentary evidence for theories that had previously been based on circumstantial speculation and second-hand accounts. The Swanson marginalia, as these annotations came to be known, included specific details about Kosminski's identification by a witness, his subsequent surveillance by police, and his eventual institutionalization for mental illness. These notes provided the most direct evidence available from a contemporary investigator about the identity of the killer, though they also raised new questions about why this information had not been acted upon more definitively at the time, and why it had remained private rather than being included in official reports. Archival research in the records of Victorian mental health institutions revealed additional documentation related to several individuals who had been considered suspects in the original investigation, including detailed case notes about their psychological conditions, treatment histories, and family circumstances. These documents provided context for understanding the mental health aspects of the case, while also illustrating the limited therapeutic options available for individuals suffering from severe psychological disorders during the late 19th century. The digitization of newspaper archives from the 1880s has made it possible for researchers to conduct comprehensive searches for contemporary coverage of the murders, revealing previously unknown articles, editorials, and letters to editors that provide insights into public opinion, official responses, and the social impact of the crimes. This material has been particularly valuable for understanding how the case was perceived by different segments of Victorian society and how media coverage influenced both public opinion and police strategy. Private family archives have yielded correspondence and personal documents from individuals who were connected to the investigation or who lived in Whitechapel during the relevant period, providing personal perspectives on the events that complement the official records and newspaper accounts. These materials include letters, diaries, and family histories that offer intimate glimpses into how ordinary people experienced and understood the terror that gripped their community. Immigration records and ship passenger lists have enabled researchers to trace the movements and backgrounds of various suspects and witnesses, providing verification for some claims, while disproving others that had been accepted without sufficient documentation. This genealogical research has been particularly important for understanding the complex ethnic and social dynamics of the East End community, and how these factors influenced both the commission of the crimes and the Investigation that followed legal archives have preserved court records, coroner's reports and other official documents that provide detailed information about the victims, the crime scenes and the legal procedures that were followed during the investigation. These materials have been essential for establishing accurate timelines, understanding the evidentiary standards of the period, and evaluating the thoroughness and competence of the official investigation. The correspondence files of prominent Victorian figures, including politicians, social reformers, and medical professionals, have revealed previously unknown connections to the case and insights into how the murders influenced broader discussions about social policy, law enforcement, and urban reform. These documents demonstrate the wider-ranging impact that the Ripper case had on Victorian society. Beyond its immediate effects on the East End community, international archives have provided information about how the Ripper case was covered and understood in other countries, revealing the global dimension of the public fascination with the murders and the ways in which the story was adapted and interpreted for different cultural contexts. This comparative material has been valuable for understanding the universal aspects of the case's appeal and the specific features that reflected uniquely British social and cultural conditions. The application of contemporary criminal psychology and forensic psychiatry to the Jack the Ripper case has produced increasingly sophisticated analyses of the killer's likely psychological characteristics, motivations, and behavioral patterns, drawing on decades of research into serial killing, sexual violence, and psychopathic personality disorders that were unavailable to Victorian investigators who had to rely on much more limited theoretical frameworks for understanding extreme criminal behavior. Dr. David Cantor, a leading figure in the development of investigative psychology, has applied modern profiling techniques to the Ripper case, analyzing the geographic patterns of the murders, the evolution of the killer's methods over time, and the psychological significance of the mutilations and body positioning. His analysis suggests a perpetrator who combined high levels of psychopathy with sufficient social skills to blend into the East End community while pursuing his violent fantasies. Contemporary forensic psychiatrists have paid particular attention to the ritualistic aspects of the Ripper murders, interpreting the specific patterns of mutilation and the apparent time spent with victims after death as evidence of deep-seated psychological compulsions that went beyond simple homicidal violence. The killer's apparent need to engage in post-mortem activities suggests someone driven by complex fantasy systems that required elaborate behavioral scripts to achieve psychological satisfaction. The letters attributed to the Ripper have been subjected to sophisticated linguistic and psychological analysis, using techniques that can identify personality characteristics, educational background and mental state from written communication. Modern experts have noted the grandiose tone of the correspondence, the apparent pleasure taken in public attention, and the strategic understanding of media dynamics that suggests a narcissistic personality with above-average intelligence and social awareness. Behavioral analysis of the crime scenes has revealed patterns that suggest the killer possessed both organizational and disorganizational characteristics, carefully planning his attacks while also exhibiting impulsive and emotionally driven behavior during the actual commission of the crimes. This combination of rational planning with explosive violence is consistent with modern understanding of certain types of serial killers who can function normally in social situations while harboring extreme violent fantasies. The geographic analysis of the murder locations using contemporary techniques for understanding criminal spatial behavior has provided insights into the killer's likely residence work patterns and familiarity with the East End. The cluster of crime scenes suggests someone who lived or worked in the immediate area and who possessed intimate knowledge of the neighborhood's physical and social geography, including the timing of police patrols and the movement patterns of potential victims. Modern experts have also analyzed the apparent cessation of the murders, considering various psychological and practical explanations for why the killer might have stopped his activities. Possibilities include death, imprisonment for other crimes, mental breakdown leading to institutionalization, relocation to another area, or psychological satisfaction of whatever compulsions had driven the original crimes. Each of these scenarios implies different personality characteristics and life circumstances. The victimology of the Ripper case has been re-examined using contemporary understanding of how serial killers select their targets, revealing patterns that suggest the perpetrator was specifically drawn to vulnerable women who were unlikely to be missed quickly and whose lifestyles brought them into contact with strangers in isolated locations. This victim selection pattern indicates both opportunistic and strategic thinking about risk management and detection avoidance. Psychological autopsy techniques have been applied to the limited information available about the killer's apparent personality and behavior, constructing a profile that emphasizes antisocial personality characteristics, sexual sadism, and the kind of organized thinking that would have been necessary to commit multiple murders without detection in a heavily populated urban area under intensive police investigation. The integration of historical evidence with modern psychological theory has produced a more nuanced understanding of the Ripper as someone who combined the capacity for extreme violence with the social skills necessary to maintain a facade of normalcy, someone who could plan methodically while also being driven by compulsions that ultimately made continued criminal activity unsustainable. This profile helps explain both the killer's initial success in avoiding detection and his apparent inability to continue his activities indefinitely. Chapter 8. The question remains. There is a peculiar comfort in mysteries that resist solution, a way that unsolved questions can serve purposes that definitive answers might actually undermine. The case of Jack the Ripper has endured for more than a century, not despite its lack of resolution, but perhaps because of it offering each generation the opportunity to project its own fears, theories, and understanding of human nature onto a historical canvas that remains sufficiently blank to accommodate almost any interpretation. The absence of a definitive solution to the Ripper case has allowed it to function as a kind of cultural mirror, reflecting the anxieties and preoccupations of different eras as they have attempted to make sense of extreme violence and social breakdown. Victorian investigators saw in the murders a reflection of urban decay and moral corruption, while 20th century analysts found evidence of psychological disorders and social pathology, and contemporary researchers apply the tools of modern forensic science and criminal psychology to evidence that may be too degraded or incomplete to yield the certainty they seek. The mystery has also served as a testing ground for evolving approaches to criminal investigation, from the methodical but technologically limited procedures of Inspector Abberline to the sophisticated DNA analysis and psychological profiling techniques employed by modern researchers. Each generation has brought its best available tools to bear on the case, and the failure of these tools to produce definitive results has often led to important advances in investigative methodology and theoretical understanding. Perhaps most significantly, the unsolved nature of the Ripper case has preserved it as a space for contemplating fundamental questions about the nature of evil, the limits of human understanding, and the relationship between individual pathology and social breakdown. A solved case would become simply another example of criminal behavior successfully addressed by law enforcement. But an unsolved case remains a puzzle that challenges our assumptions about justice closure and the possibility of fully comprehending the darker aspects of human nature. The continuing fascination with the Ripper mystery also reflects a deep-seated human need to believe that such extreme forms of violence must have comprehensible explanations, that there must be identifiable causes and preventable conditions that can account for behavior that seems to violate fundamental assumptions about civilized society. The search for the killer's identity becomes a way of seeking reassurance that such crimes are aberrations rather than possibilities that exist within the normal range of human potential. At the same time, the failure to solve the case serves as a reminder of the limits of human knowledge and institutional capability, a humbling acknowledgement that some questions may be unanswerable, and some forms of evil may be beyond our capacity to fully understand or prevent. This recognition can be disturbing, but it can also be oddly liberating, freeing us from the burden of believing that all problems have solutions and all mysteries can be resolved through sufficient application of intelligence and resources. The preservation of the Ripper mystery has also created space for the kind of intellectual play and creative speculation that solved cases cannot accommodate. Writers, researchers, and amateur investigators have been able to explore theories and possibilities that would be inappropriate or irrelevant if the case had been definitively closed, leading to creative work and scholarly analysis that has enriched our understanding of Victorian society, criminal psychology, and the process of historical investigation. The tourist industry that has grown up around the Ripper case represents another way that the unsolved mystery has continued to serve social and economic functions long after the original crimes ceased to pose any direct threat to public safety. The walking tours, museums, and popular culture productions that draw visitors to the East End provide economic benefits to the community, while also serving as a form of collective memory that keeps historical awareness alive in ways that might not occur if the case had been solved and forgotten. The psychological tension between our desire for definitive answers and our capacity to live with uncertainty lies at the heart of why the Jack the Ripper case continues to captivate public imagination more than a century after the murders occurred. This tension reflects fundamental aspects of human cognition and emotional processing that make unsolved mysteries simultaneously frustrating and compelling, creating a kind of intellectual itch that we cannot stop ourselves from trying to scratch. Closure represents one of the most basic human psychological needs, the desire to create coherent narratives that explain events and assign meaning to experiences that might otherwise seem random or incomprehensible. In criminal cases, closure typically involves the identification, prosecution, and punishment of perpetrators, a process that transforms chaotic violence into ordered justice and allows communities to move forward with confidence that threats have been neutralized and moral balance has been restored. The absence of closure in the Ripper case has created a particular form of psychological discomfort that has persisted across generations, a sense that something important remains incomplete and that justice has been denied not only to the immediate victims, but to the broader community that was terrorized by the crimes. This discomfort helps explain the continuing efforts to solve the case, as each new theory or piece of evidence offers the possibility of finally achieving the resolution that has been so long delayed. However, the search for closure can sometimes interfere with accurate understanding and realistic assessment of available evidence, creating pressure to accept solutions that provide emotional satisfaction rather than meeting rigorous standards of proof. The numerous theories that have been proposed to explain the Ripper murders often reflect this tension, offering definitive answers that may be more appealing than the honest acknowledgement that the evidence is insufficient to support any particular conclusion. The alternative to seeking closure is learning to accept uncertainty as a permanent condition rather than a temporary obstacle to be overcome through sufficient investigation and analysis. This acceptance requires a fundamental shift in how we think about knowledge, justice, and the relationship between human understanding and the complexity of historical events. It means acknowledging that some questions may be unanswerable and some mysteries may be permanent. Features of our collective experience. Accepting uncertainty can actually be more intellectually honest and emotionally mature than insisting on closure at any cost, allowing us to engage with complex historical questions without the distorting pressure to reach definitive conclusions. This approach can lead to more nuanced understanding of the multiple factors that contributed to the Ripper murders and their aftermath, including the social conditions that made such crimes possible, and the institutional responses that shaped their investigation and cultural interpretation. The capacity to live with uncertainty is also essential for understanding the broader historical context in which the Ripper murders occurred. Recognizing that they were part of a complex web of social, economic, and cultural factors that cannot be reduced to simple explanations or straightforward narratives of cause and effect. This more sophisticated understanding may be more valuable than the false certainty that comes from accepting inadequately supported solutions. Learning to appreciate mystery for its own sake, rather than simply as a problem to be solved, can also enrich our engagement with historical questions and contemporary challenges. The Ripper case becomes more interesting when viewed as an ongoing exploration of human nature and social dynamics, rather than simply as a criminal investigation that has failed to reach its proper conclusion. The tension between closure and uncertainty also reflects broader questions about the nature of historical knowledge and the limitations of evidence-based investigation. Historical events always involve elements that cannot be fully reconstructed or completely understood, and acknowledging these limitations is essential for maintaining intellectual honesty and avoiding the temptation to fill gaps in knowledge with speculation or wishful thinking. Ultimately, the choice between seeking closure and accepting uncertainty is not an either-or decision, but an ongoing process of balancing our need for understanding with realistic assessment of what can be known based on available evidence. The Ripper case offers an excellent opportunity to practice this balance, engaging seriously with the evidence, while acknowledging the limitations that prevent definitive resolution. In the end, Jack the Ripper has become something far larger than the individual who committed those terrible crimes in the autumn of 1888, evolving into a symbol that carries multiple meanings and serves various psychological and cultural functions for each generation that encounters the story. The transformation from historical reality to cultural archetype represents one of the most fascinating aspects of how societies process traumatic events and create narratives that help them understand and cope with experiences that exceed normal comprehension. The Ripper represents, perhaps most fundamentally, the fear of unknown evil that can emerge from the familiar world around us. The possibility that ordinary social interactions and everyday urban environments might conceal threats that are both invisible and deadly. This fear resonates across different historical periods and cultural contexts because it touches on universal anxieties about safety, trust, and the reliability of the social bonds that hold communities together. The figure of Jack the Ripper also embodies anxieties about modernity and urban life that were particularly acute during the late Victorian period, but have continued to influence how people think about cities' technology and social change. The murders occurred at a time when London was experiencing rapid growth and transformation, and the killer's ability to move through the urban landscape without detection seemed to confirm fears that modern city life created new forms of vulnerability and isolation. The gendered aspects of the Ripper murders have made the case a powerful symbol in discussions about violence against women, male aggression, and the ways that society responds to crimes that target vulnerable populations. The killer's selection of female victims from the most marginalized segments of society, combined with the sexual nature of the violence and mutilation, has made the case a touchstone for feminist analysis of patriarchal violence and social inequality. The class dimensions of the case have also contributed to its symbolic power, as the killer's ability to prey upon the poor while apparently remaining invisible to middle-class society seemed to confirm anxieties about social division and moral responsibility. The contrast between the killer's apparent sophistication and the poverty of his victims created a narrative about social predation that continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about inequality and social justice. The international fascination with the Ripper case has made it a symbol of British culture and history that transcends its specific geographic and temporal origins, representing a particular form of Victorian Gothic sensibility that continues to influence popular culture and artistic expression. The fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel have become a universal setting for stories about mystery, danger, and the darker aspects of human nature. The persistence of the Ripper mystery has also made it a symbol of the limits of human knowledge and institutional capability, representing the possibility that some forms of evil may be beyond our capacity to understand or prevent. This symbolic function has made the case a useful reference point for discussions about the nature of evil, the effectiveness of criminal justice systems, and the relationship between individual pathology and social breakdown. The continuing efforts to solve the Ripper case using new technologies and analytical methods have made it a symbol of the ongoing human quest for truth and understanding. representing both the persistence of scientific inquiry and the humility required to acknowledge when definitive answers may not be achievable. Each new theory or piece of evidence becomes part of an ongoing dialogue about the nature of historical knowledge and the methods we use to investigate the past. The commercialization and popularization of the Ripper story have also made it a symbol of how societies transform traumatic events into entertainment and tourist attractions, raising questions about the ethics of profiting from historical suffering and the ways that popular culture can both preserve and distort historical memory. The walking tours, museums, and fictional adaptations that have grown up around the case represent the complex relationship between historical preservation and commercial exploitation. Perhaps most significantly, Jack the Ripper has become a symbol of the enduring human fascination with mystery and the unknown, representing our capacity to be simultaneously horrified and intrigued by events that challenge our understanding of human nature and social order. The case continues to generate new books, documentaries, and research projects, not because it offers easy answers, but because it provides a compelling framework for exploring questions that have no easy answers. In our collective memory, Jack the Ripper represents the shadow side of human civilization, the reminder that beneath the surface of ordered society lie possibilities for violence and chaos that we ignore at our peril. At the same time, the case also represents the human capacity for resilience, investigation, and meaning-making in the face of incomprehensible events, showing how communities can survive trauma and transform suffering into understanding. As we reach the end of our journey through the gaslit streets of Victorian London and the labyrinthine passages of one of history's most enduring mysteries, we find ourselves not with answers, but with something perhaps more valuable: a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human nature and the intricate ways that past and present continue to speak to one another across the centuries. The question that brought us together tonight, was Jack the Ripper ever caught, remains unanswered, but our exploration has revealed that this absence of resolution is not a failure of investigation or understanding, but rather an invitation to engage with history as a living conversation rather than a closed book. The mystery endures, not because the evidence is insufficient, though it may be, but because the questions it raises about justice, safety, and the nature of evil are themselves eternal, requiring each generation to wrestle with them anew. Inspector Abberline, walking his final beat through the streets, he knew so well understood that police work was ultimately about more than solving crimes. It was about maintaining the delicate social bonds that allow communities to function in the face of uncertainty and threat. His methodical investigation, though it failed to identify the killer, succeeded in demonstrating that society could respond to unprecedented challenges with professionalism, compassion, and persistent dedication to truth. The victims of those terrible autumn months, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, deserve to be remembered not simply as footnotes to a famous mystery, but as individuals whose lives, however brief and difficult, contributed to the rich tapestry of human experience that we call history. Their deaths shocked a city and changed the course of criminal investigation. But their lives remind us that every person carries within themselves stories of hope, struggle, and the quiet dignity that characterizes ordinary human existence. The streets of Whitechapel today echo with different languages and different dreams than those that filled them in 1888, but they remain places where people gather to build lives and communities despite uncertainty and hardship. The fear that once walked these cobblestones has given way to other challenges and other hopes. Part of the endless human project of creating meaning and connection in an often incomprehensible world. Perhaps the greatest lesson we can draw from our time with this old mystery is not about the identity of a long-dead killer, but about our own capacity to sit quietly with questions that have no easy answers, to find peace in the midst of uncertainty, and to trust that some stories are valuable, not because they provide closure, but because they keep us company in the darkness, reminding us that we are not alone in our wonder and our fear. As you settle into sleep tonight, Carry with you not the terror of those distant autumn nights, but the quiet confidence of Inspector Abberline making his careful notes, the resilience of a community that survived and healed, and the enduring human capacity to transform even the darkest chapters of our shared story into opportunities for understanding, compassion, and hope. The fog lifts from the streets of memory, the gaslight fades to gentle darkness, and somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, the past and present continue their eternal conversation, whispering secrets that we are still learning how to hear.